2 years after declaring the biggest bankruptcy in history, Lehman Brothers is back in business. It has almost $20 billion in cash and a monthly payroll of up to $45 million for managers and advisors. To understand what happened at Lehman, we turn now to our next guest, Peter Chapman, the author of The Last of the Imperious Rich. The book chronicles the firm's history from September 11th, 1844, when Henry Lehman arrived in New York City from Germany, to September 15th of 2008, when CEO Dick Fuld filed for corporate bankruptcy. Peter's also an editor and writer for the Financial Times. He joins us now from our bureau in London. Peter, welcome to Bloomberg News. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good evening, Mark. Good afternoon.
Sir, tell me about Henry Lehman's odyssey. We did mention the irony, September 11th, 1844. Talk to me about this man and how he came here and how he started this storied firm.
Well, Henry Lehman came from troubled Europe. He came from Bavaria, part of a Jewish family. Jews weren't very well treated in Europe at the time, and particularly in Germany, where Henry came from. He sailed across the Atlantic. It took weeks to do so. When he got to New York, he didn't stop there. He went on to Alabama. He was from an agricultural background, and he was going to where cotton was king. Lehman Brothers set up, first of all, in the South, built themselves up into a prosperous cotton brokerage. But first, Henry Lehman was a peddler on the byways of Alabama, opened a general store, developed a cotton business. Then, around the build-up to the Civil War, the Lehman family decided to widen its options and move north to New York, and that's where they created their bank.
Peter, there was a seminal moment, not only for the Lehman Brothers, but also for the nation as well, and that was the stock market crash. And you write in your book, the crash soon changed the image of the banker from protector of the public's money to greedy shyster out to profit at public expense. Can you draw an arc from that statement, from that time in history, to what happened to Lehman 2 years ago today?
Well, that's right. Immediately after, or rather in the period after the great crash of '29, things moved then to the Depression, Roosevelt came to power. Governor Herbert Lehman of New York was Roosevelt's right-hand man in creating the New Deal. They brought the banks under control, and for quite a few years, with things like the Glass-Steagall Act and things like that, the banks, I won't say they were brought to heel, they had a very good living, but they were under control. But then, in about the last 30 years, we saw companies, particularly companies like Lehman Brothers, which had depended on long-term investment, wise, conservative banking, risk-taking, but always well-calculated risk. We saw about 30 years ago that change to a situation where traders took over, short-termists, people going for quick profit. And I think that was the beginning of the end. We go back to about 30 years ago when Lehman Brothers was converting into being more of a bond house, quick turnover. Previously, in the old days, Lehman Brothers had dealt in material goods of real worth, and the material, or rather the materials that Lehman Brothers were dealing at the end were hardly substantial goods at all. In fact, It's fair to say, I think, that they were junk.
Peter, how far away from Henry Lehman's practices, from his integrity, from his development of the firm, how far away from that did the current Lehman Brothers stray?
Well, I think they strayed an awful long way. Henry Lehman was a peddler on the roads of Alabama, going from one plantation to another, and as a foreigner, a newly arrived person, he couldn't afford to go doing anything illicit or any cheap deals or whatever. He'd have been caught. He wouldn't have made a very good living. Lehman Brothers wouldn't have done very well in its early years like that. In the end, Dick Fuld and people had hundreds of peddlers, if you like, thousands of people out there selling cheap mortgages to people who in the end couldn't afford them. These were then being sold on in all those complex mortgage bonds, collateralized debt obligations with very dubious mathematics behind them, and they were being hawked off both in the United States and around the world. So I'd say that journey from honest peddler in the early days of Lehman Brothers to the institution that collapsed 2 years ago today, I'd say that was a long journey indeed.
Peter, let me ask you, because my partner Julie Hyman interviewed Kevin White earlier, and Kevin, she pointed out the anecdote that he went to Mr. Fuld's office, following the collapse, and they shared a hug and they shared some words. And Kevin told Julie that Dick Fuld is a compassionate man who cared about the Lehman family. I was wondering if I might get your reaction to that assessment.
Well, that may be true, and the world is full of very nice people, very kind people. They don't always get it right. My particular view was, and I'm not blaming Mr. Ford individually or in particular, but there was an ethos that grew up over the last 25 years that seemed mainly bent on getting huge profits and getting very huge bonuses and payments. 40 million a year. Dick Ford, I think, a couple of years before the end, drew a salary of 40 million and possibly felt that he wasn't very well off, given that Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs would have drawn about 54 million at the time. I think these numbers were out of all proportion to what ordinary people are used to, and the collapse that happened, talking in billions and billions, was out of all proportion to what people had expected. It shocked a lot of people.